The fire at Adobe Springs was almost out when the shot cracked through the camp. The night was cold enough that the horse's breath hung in little clouds, and the only sounds had been the creak of leather and the occasional pop from the coals. The traveling preacher, Reverend Nathan Cole, lay rolled in his blanket near the wagon. His hat was tipped over his face, boots still on, the way men slept when they had to be ready to move at first light. Across from him, his partner, a wiry man named Elias Hart, sat awake, hands wrapped around a tin cup that had long since gone cold. He had been mumbling under his breath for the better part of an hour, head tilted like he was listening to someone only he could hear. The moon slid out from behind a cloud just as he stood. The pistol had been lying beside him, half covered by his coat. He picked it up with a slow, careful motion, as if he were afraid to wake the sleeping man before he was ready. For a long moment he simply stared at Reverend Cole's blanketed back. Then he stepped closer, the gravel crunching under his boots. He raised the pistol, his fingers trembling, and fired once into the preacher's skull. The shot echoed off the low hills and died into the vast dark. The horses jerked at their picket line. A coyote yipped in the distance. Elias stood over the body, chest heaving, the gun still pointed downward. Then, as if a string had been cut, he dropped the weapon, turned, and walked off into the night without a word. By the time dawn touched the sagebrush around Adobe Springs, only the body of the preacher, the wagon, and the stirred-up dust of his partner's footprints remained. To understand how those two men ended up at that lonely patch of water in the New Mexico Territory in 1884, you have to go back a few weeks. Reverend Nathan Cole had been riding a circuit between scattered ranches and mining camps, the kind of preacher who carried his church in his saddlebags. He married couples under cottonwoods, buried them on windy hills, and held Sunday meetings in adobe rooms that smelled of dust and kerosene. He was not famous, but the people along the trail knew his name. They said he listened more than he talked, and gave away most of what he owned. Work on the frontier, though, was never safe. Highwaymen trailed the stage routes, and Apaches, forced into smaller and smaller lands, still raided when they needed horses or food. That spring, Nathan agreed to travel with Elias Hart, a man he had known only a short time. Elias called himself a prospector and sometimes guided freight wagons when money ran thin. He was jumpy, but hard-working. The two men shared a wagon for a run between Deming and the scattered settlements along the Gila. Nathan carried a trunk of Bibles and medicine. Elias carried a bedroll, a pick, and a revolver that looked older than he was. From the start of the journey, people noticed Elias talking to himself. At the trading post in Mimbres, he sat on the porch rail and muttered under his breath while the preacher checked the mail. In camp, he sometimes jolted awake from sleep, shouting at shadows. When Nathan asked if he was all right, Elias said he heard warnings on the wind and laughed it off. The preacher chalked it up to too many nights alone and let it pass. On the afternoon they reached Adobe Springs, the sky was clear and the wind light. The springs were little more than a cluster of cottonwoods around a shallow pool that seeped out of the ground, enough to water horses and fill canteens. The place sat well off the main trail, which made it attractive to men wanting a quiet camp and to those who wanted to avoid notice. Nathan liked it because there was shade. Elias liked it because you could see trouble coming from a long way off. They watered the horses, cooked beans over a fire, and shared the last of a loaf picked up at a ranch house 2 days earlier. While they ate, Nathan talked about the families they'd seen along the way. The woman whose baby had been born too early, the miner with a busted leg, the boy who wanted to learn to read. Elias listened, eyes drifting toward the empty hills. When Nathan finished, Elias said only, "Voices say you ought not keep going." "Which voices are those?" Nathan asked, trying to keep his tone gentle. "The ones that know what's coming." Elias tapped the side of his head. "They've been talking louder." Nathan had heard stories of men breaking under the strain of the frontier, solitary prospectors who came out of the hills hearing things, ranch hands driven wild by isolation and heat. He wondered if Elias had been that way before they met, or if it had gotten worse on the trail. Either way, the preacher's instinct was to help, not abandon. He suggested a prayer. Elias refused, muttering that the voices didn't like it. By full dark, the fire had burned down to embers. Nathan rolled into his blanket, trusting that whatever troubled Elias would quiet with rest. The last thing he remembered was the hiss of the wind moving through the cottonwoods and the small sounds of the camp settling, harness leather creaking, the horses shifting, the clink of Elias setting down his tin cup. The next morning, when a passing freight wagon spotted the still smoking fire and turned aside for water, they found a scene that made hardened muleteers go silent. Reverend Cole lay on his side, blanket pulled up to his shoulders, hat tipped over his face. Dried blood matted the hair above his ear. The ground around his head was dark and stiff. The pistol lay a few feet away. One set of tracks led off into the open desert. The freighters covered the preacher's body with a canvas sheet and rode hard for the nearest law. Word reached Silver City by nightfall. Sheriff's deputies, a local doctor, and a justice of the peace went out to Adobe Springs the next day. The doctor examined the body on the tailgate of the wagon. The bullet had entered behind the ear at close range. There were no signs of a struggle, no extra bruises, no rope marks. Nathan had likely died in his sleep. Inside the wagon they found his trunk, undisturbed. Bibles stacked beside little bottles of laudanum and carbolic, letters from families along his route, a journal written in a neat, steady hand. There was money, but not much. Hardly enough to call robbery a motive. Elias's bedroll, canteen, and pick were gone. His name was not on any wanted posters in the territory, but a rancher recognized the description and told the sheriff that Hart had once claimed voices woke him at night and argued in his head like card players. The lawmen followed the tracks leading away from the springs until wind and hard ground swallowed them. They circulated word to nearby forts and stage stations. A lean, dark-haired man, traveling without a horse, armed, possibly deranged. A handful of riders swore they had seen someone matching that description over the next few weeks. Once near the San Francisco River, once along the Mogollon foothills, but every lead ended in empty air. The territory was too wide, and there were too many men alone in it. As months passed, the case around Adobe Springs turned into something between a warning and a ghost story. Some said Hart had wandered into the desert and died of thirst, his bones bleaching under the same sun that baked the trail dust into the wagon ruts. Others believed he'd slipped south into Mexico, trading his name for a new one and burying his guilt under years of distance. A few claimed he still skulked along back canyons, flinching at every wind gust, arguing with voices that never stopped. For the people who had known Reverend Cole, the mystery had only one fixed point. A kind man shot in his sleep by the person sharing his fire, churchgoers in scattered settlements took up a collection to bury him properly. His grave marker, set in a small hilltop cemetery, was simple: name, dates, and a short line from a hymn he favored. On more than one Sunday, someone would pause after services and ask the new preacher if there had been any word of Hart. There never was. Adobe Springs stayed what it had always been, a quiet spot of water along a hard trail. Travelers still camped there when they had to. They built their fires a little closer to the wagon and kept a closer eye on whoever shared their camp. When the wind hissed through the cottonwoods at night, bending the shadows across the ground, some remembered the story of the preacher and the partner who claimed that voices made him pull the trigger. In the official books, the killing at Adobe Springs never became more than a thin folder. A dead man, a missing man, an unserved warrant crumbling at the edges. But on the old frontier, stories traveled farther than paperwork. The name Elias Hart became a quiet reminder that sometimes the danger wasn't on the ridge or behind a rock. Sometimes it was the man on the far side of the fire, staring into the flames and listening to something no one else could hear. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.